Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us in this important College of Theology presentation as part of GCU's Integrity Week. My name is Dr. Rich Holland. I'm one of GCU's faculty members in the College of Theology. I teach in the area of philosophy, and I will be the moderator for this afternoon's event. Our topic is identity and integrity. Who are we and how should we live? And by the way, the QR code there is GCU does ask that you would check in. They keep track of attendance at our events here, so I'd appreciate if you do that. So our topic, identity and integrity. Who are we and how should we live? Typically, I think in everyday conversation, when we speak of matters of integrity, it's fairly common for us to think of integrity as in terms of how we act, how we behave, how we live our lives, especially as we are seen by and interact with others. C.S. Lewis, who is probably one of the 20th century's most important Christian thinkers, though, reminds us that when we're thinking about integrity, it's certainly about much more than just our behavior. He uses an illustration here. I'm just going to read a segment from Lewis's Mere Christianity on this topic. He says there are two ways things can go wrong with the human. He says one is when human individuals drift apart from one another or else collide with one another and do one another damage by cheating or bullying. The other is when things go wrong inside the individual, when the different parts of him, his different faculties and desires and so on, either drift apart or interfere with one another. You can get the idea plain if you think of us as a fleet of ships sailing in formation. The voyage will be a success only in the first place if the ships do not collide and get in one another's way. And secondly, if each ship is seaworthy and has her engines in good order. As a matter of fact, he says, you cannot have either of these two things without the other. If the ships keep on having collisions, they will not remain seaworthy very long. On the other hand, if their steering gears are out of order, they will not be able to avoid collisions. Our topic today seeks to address this perhaps often overlooked aspect of integrity, and that is the individual. In fact, if you think about the word integrity, it has built into the idea of the word this idea of an undivided self, or a whole, consistent, coherent self. And that's the topic that we're going to address today. It's essential that we consider, if we're going to ask the questions in terms of interacting with each other, if we're going to ask how should we live, or how should we interact with each other, how should we treat each other, there's really no way to answer that question until we first answer the more fundamental question: what am I? What kind of a thing am I? What is my constitution? What am I made of? What am I designed for? And those sorts of things. And so our panelists will be addressing topics related to this. We're going to begin with each of our three panelists offering a brief presentation on the topic, and then that will be followed by an opportunity for you to ask questions of our panelists and interact with them on their presentations and on the topic in general. Let me first just introduce the panel today. We have in our panel today three College of Theology faculty members. First, who will be presenting is Dr. Dan Kemp, who teaches in the areas of philosophy and Christian worldview. And Dr. Kemp's presentation, What is Integrity and Why Care, addresses Plato, who famously argued that virtue is required to maintain a singular identity, which has come to be known as having integrity. But why care about having a unified identity? Dan is going to argue that unity of self is required for unity of purpose, which is in turn a component of ordinary human action. Next, after Dr. Kemp's presentation, Dr. Joe Miller will be presenting. He teaches in the area of Christian worldview, and his presentation is entitled Flourishing and the Five Facets of Identity. Inspired by Aristotle's fourfold model of causality, Dr. Miller will present a uniquely Christian fivefold model of identity, which is fundamental to understanding the reality of human personhood and a necessary guide to experiencing human flourishing. Finally, Dr. Linnell Mason, who also teaches here in the area of philosophy and Christian worldview. Dr. Mason's presentation will address various philosophical aspects, ideas about identity, landing on Aristotle's and Aquinas' idea that what a thing is determined by its capacities and powers and the potential to become what it can become. Dr. Mason will argue that human beings have certain capacities and powers and are made to be united with God. And thus, if we don't live in accordance with our identity as human beings, we set ourselves up for devastating consequences. Join me in welcoming our panelists. First up is Dr. Kemp. Dr. Kemp?
Thank you for being here. I know there's a lot competing for your time and attention on a Monday afternoon at GCU, so I don't take that lightly. I really appreciate being here to listen to this. I'm going to read what I have because I find this to be a pretty thorny topic with lots of contours that, for me, risks becoming unfocused. So I'm going to read what I have to say, so bear with me as I read through this. Integrity is widely considered a virtue. If we follow Plato and Aristotle and the many Christian moralists after them, to be a virtue, something must make a unique contribution to a complete and blessed life. If something is a virtue, then its absence compromises a person's ability to have a truly good life. In that case, it lacks something that would make it better. So in this short talk, I want to ask the question, what is integrity? And I want to gesture towards an answer. And given such severe time constraints, I can do no more than gesture. I hope, however, the direction will also point in the direction of the first question. What does integrity add to the truly blessed life? Integrity is lexically defined in the first place as simple moral uprightness. To have integrity is simply to have a disposition to act morally. The man of integrity cannot be bribed, as the saying goes. If you are morally upright, then you have integrity, and if you have integrity, then if you lack integrity, then you lack moral uprightness in just that respect. So much is true, yet the word seems to refer to something more specific than mere moral uprightness. For example, when you hear someone report to you that the money laundering scandal revealed that Nate acted in a morally blameless way, you have some idea of what that means, but not much. At least you know that it means that he was generally not implicated in the scandal. But when you hear the money laundering scandal revealed that Shannon acted with the utmost integrity, you learn something more specific. You suspect, for example, that she may have been involved in exposing the laundering scandal, that she may have turned down bribes and blackmails, and so on. There are cases of acting in morally blameless ways that we wouldn't say are cases of acting with integrity, not because they reveal a lack of integrity, but because the concept simply does not apply to them. So the latter, thicker concept of integrity is composed of broadly two parts. The first is unity, and architectural analogies are apt here. A dam or a bridge has structural integrity if its parts work together to preserve the whole. Second, and relatedly, integrity is often connected with identity, undividedness, though it is not always clear what the link is. Still, the general shape of the connection can be made clear enough. To have integrity in this way is to have a consistent character through time, to act consistently, to have a generally consistent psychological profile. We can see how these two parts fit together. To have integrity is for the parts to fit together to make a whole. In the case of virtue, a person with integrity, who has integrity, it is to have a unified approach to life. And so far I agree, but the content of the idea of consistent needs to be fleshed out in more detail. And so as is often the case, this gloss on integrity can be clarified by reflections on examples of an acute lack of integrity. So for example, the adulterous man lacks integrity, and so a coherent self. He wishes to be with his mistress, because he cannot bind himself to the object of his lust unless he first destroyed his current bonds of love. So he either cannot enjoy the affair fully, or else he does so in some sort of ignorance. An ignorance that is as astounding as it is common. And this ignorance does not necessarily include ignorance of particular facts related to the effects of his actions. Say facts related to the effects on his children, or on his mistress's children, or her spouse, or the costs of child support, divorce, alimony, or any other empirical reflection that may dissuade him from engaging the affair. The kind of ignorance at play here is the kind that invites the condemning exhortation, think about what you've done. The kind of we might think of a friend who pleads repentance in him when he says, for goodness sake, man, think about what you're doing to your life. Do you really want to throw that away? Such reflection, if successful in producing repentance, does not necessarily involve the revelation of new facts previously unknown, but on the meaning of one's own actions. The case of adultery puts the connection of unity to identity front and center in the concept of integrity. The faithful man has integrity just in that respect, because the parts of his life are unified just in that respect. He does not act the part of the husband to one woman on Tuesdays and to another on Fridays. And so, just in this respect at least, he has a coherent self. Because his full commitment to his life as it is, because of his full commitment to the life as it is, not to the life as he'd like it to be. He can enjoy his life as it is. He can celebrate it. He can pursue it without the sort of ignorance mentioned before. If taken alone, this example presents a picture of integrity as static, as primarily preventing change when temptations come along. To have the virtue of integrity is to be the same from one time to another. I think, however, other examples show that this is not the case. So think of a doting mother who frets over her baby boy to such a degree that his maturation is severely and permanently stifled. She may treat her pastor, for example, or her plumber as adults, but her son is always her baby, quote unquote, even if the pastor and plumber are younger than he. And as a result, he never really leaves the easy comfort of her love, and so never really makes anything of himself in his life. She may complain about his laziness, his lack of drive, the extra laundry and the dishes that it causes her, and yet she is pleased, and everyone knows it. In this case, no single act marks the sin, as in the case of adultery. Yet the lack of integrity is present all the same. Now, the problem with integrity is in its relation to identity in the case of the doting mother is subtler than in the case of adultery. There, in the latter case, the problem is obvious. The man who wants to traverse the intraversable, to sunder the unsunderable. If he fully understood the meaning of his actions, he would know that he must turn away love, in this case, to get the love he wants. And so he pretends to be someone else, or to, quote-unquote, start over, as we so often hear. As if this declaration of starting over had the power to create a clean slate in and of itself. I hereby declare broken the very bond of love that I am about to declare unbreakable. He has a kind of gap in his life, as if his character glitched between multiple lives. The problem is that we can't live multiple lives. And he is one man. And because he cannot fully give himself to one, they add up to nothing. And the sum of the two parts of his double life is no life, fully at least. Now the mother cannot be analyzed the same way. For no such gap exists in her. She is singularly devoted to her boy, and that never changes. She does not make the changes natural, however, to the parental form of love, when the standards internal to that love would guide her to make changes. And so she also, in her current state, either cannot have true joy in her love because she is rejecting that love, or else have it in a way that's ignorance to its true meaning. It is because of her stasis, her lack of change in this case, however, that she never fully understands the joy of motherhood, as cruel as it might sound to say. To be a mother, at risk of being condescending, among other things, is to care for a growing thing, not merely or even primarily physically, but mentally and spiritually growing. That thing, if all goes well, will develop into an adult, a sort of equal, because he will no longer need her. There is a sense in which parenthood comes with an expiration date internal to it. And those who try to preserve parenthood beyond this date are justly suspected of monstrous perversion, like the preservatives that we cringe at when we hear are in our food that allow fruit to last a year, sitting in the sun, even when they've been picked from the vine. To live this way is to reveal a failure to appreciate what it is to love a child. However much we might be disinclined to make the judgment out of pity, we must recognize that she cannot keep her son, and so fail to change without turning away from the true meaning of her motherhood, and so forfeiting a coherent identity as a mother. It is due to reflection on lives like these that put to rest in my mind the thought that integrity should be understood in terms of stability or consistency of character or action, where such terms, stability and consistency, would predict empirical continuity across time, and you act the same in different cases. For as we've seen, while sometimes a lack of integrity is revealed in a change, sometimes it is revealed in the failure to change. And upon reflection, it was never the change or inconsistency that explained the adulterer's problem in the first place. Instead, we should see the inconsistency that he exemplifies as is constituted by his lack of seriousness about what he's doing. How can a man vow to bind himself to another if he cannot be relied on to be the same man through time? To my ear, things sound just the same in the case of the doting mother. How can she claim to love her son above all else when his true good would involve increasing autonomy and independence from her? The two share a common failure. In neither case do they adequately appreciate the meaning of their actions, and in neither case are they sufficiently serious about what they're doing. So instead, I propose, and I'm open to disagreement here obviously, instead, I recommend that we should think of integrity as seriousness about the goods available to us in our lives. Devotion to some goods in life prominently involves some goods prominently involves constancy and stability, stasis, while others prominently requires change, development, evolution. And to put the point in Christian terminology, God entrusts tasks and responsibilities to us, and whether faithfulness to those tasks requires a changing or an unchanging posture depends on what those responsibilities are. Integrity is a commitment not to undermine the purpose for which one undertakes the tasks and duties that have been entrusted to one. And specifically, it is the commitment not to undermine such purposes in doing them. If you're a car mechanic, be serious about fixing cars. Don't put bad parts in a quick fix. If you're a pastor, be serious about preaching. Don't consistently write your sermons at the last moment. If you're a college student and you desire the prestige of a college degree, be serious about the components of your college career that contribute to the prestige of that college degree. I'll let you use your imagination and application there. In other words, to have integrity, one always has to ask, what is it I'm doing? What is it I'm doing right now? And what is this for? And here we have a glimpse of what integrity provides, a person that nothing else can, to return to our starting question. How is it a virtue? What it uniquely provides to the truly blessed life. It is, I think, it gives you a sincere and truthful sense of what it is that your life is about. And if you didn't have that, you would be lacking something. You can fully accept and embrace the gifts of God and to enjoy them without ignorance. A fully Christian account of integrity would have to probe the question, given the truths of the Christian faith, given sin, for example, providence, the guidance of God, the general detached posture Christians are supposed to take towards the things of this world, that our Lord requires of us, how serious, quote unquote, should we take our lives anyway? But that question is going to have to remain unaddressed until another time. Thank you very much.
Interesting about this is we're all going to take a little different approach to these ideas. And I want to look at flourishing and the concept of identity. If I ask a simple question, who am I, right? It's a question we've all looked at, asked ourselves in the mirror. It seems like a simple enough question, but when there's so many different forces in our life, friends, family, the media, television, whatever it is, TikTok, they all influence the answer to that question, and they can kind of distort this sense of identity and who we are. And so I think one of the things that's been helpful for me is to look at Aristotle's four causes, sort of inspirationally. So Aristotle talked about the formal cause. He talked that's the cause like in the mind of a maker, the mind of a creator that makes a thing. So here we have our artisan guy. He talks about a material cause. It's the material, the stuff that our artisan is going to use to craft the object that is in his imagination. Then we look at the efficient cause. And this is the actual process that he goes through to make our lovely little clown sculpture that he has here for you. And then his final was the final cause, right? What's the ultimate purpose for which a thing is made? In this case, it's to be adored or to have crowds wonder at his marvelous creation. And so more sort of inspirationally, I want to take that idea and think about that into 5 sort of more facets of identity. And certainly all of these are causal in some sense, but they're all sort of things, this transcendent, essential, compositional, cultural, and relational parts of identity that all play a role in shaping who we are. And how we view the role of each one is going to determine a lot about our capacity to flourish as human beings. So I'll give you some quick definitions of each of these 5 facets. The compositional identity is the parts of the whole, the sort of the genotypic and the phenotypic, the internal and the external aspects of us that make up your body. Arms, legs, skin color, hair, but then of course the internal parts and all that stuff that make up who we are. There's also relational identity. It's the parts of the whole which are shaped by the communities that surround us, such as our church, our family, our work, and our friendships. So all of these relationships shape some sort of piece of our identity. The other is a cultural identity, and these are the imposition or self-perception, like feelings, and expressions of identity that change relative to conditions, such as the law, the culture, geography, and etc. All kinds of examples there. So for example, you could say, oh, I'm an American, or if you move somewhere, I'm English, whatever those be. So geographically or through different laws, they can shape, the culture tells us something about ourselves. The fourth one is our essential identity, and this is the God-designed nature of your body, essentially it's male or female. So if God has made us as male and female humans, we can't just simply take our little bear friend here and, pop off a little head and put that on, and we don't magically become a bear, right? This is not how it works, because there's something essential that's beyond the compositional element of who we are. And our fifth facet is this idea of transcendent identity. And this is the God-designed soulish nature of our being. Now, what's interesting is all of us will recognize some parts of these. Some of these are relative to the Christian worldview, others are not. And this is what's going to ultimately cause our identity to be formed and fashioned. So here's a quick definition for identity, given all of that. So the identity is the nature of a human person that corresponds to reality and shapes our purpose. So there's some nature here, and it corresponds to some reality. It's going to shape the way we choose to live our life. This concept of flourishing comes in at that piece at the end. So flourishing is going to flow from this sense of identity. But the real challenge is, when we say nature, whose nature? What nature? We say reality, what counts as reality? These become the difficult questions. So there's 2 sort of worldview frameworks that I want to look at. The first is, if I could boil down naturalism, the idea that there is no God into one phrase, I would pick the phrase, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I think this phrase sort of typifies the naturalistic framework. Now, it goes back to the guy Descartes. The French have not given us much good in life except for French fries. I know they're not French, but that's okay. It's still pretty good. Croissants are good. Croissants are very good, but their philosophy stinks. Anyway, so Descartes says this: nothing which is such that I can doubt whether it exists actually exists. Every body is such that I can doubt whether it exists. Therefore, no body actually exists. And then he writes in other places along a similar lines that based on this idea that the reality of who he is doesn't depend on any material thing. For the true self, the true me, is independent of all these physical realities, of the physical body. Now, whether Descartes meant this in a purely epistemological sense, as a way of knowing, or in the greater sense of being as our reality, that's maybe a little debatable. But in our culture, driven by a naturalistic framework, it seems that this idea of I think, therefore I am has shaped so much of who we are. Right? So if we're in this naturalistic framework, we don't have a maker, we don't have a designer, so our formal cause is nothing. Nothing is what brought us into existence. Our material cause could be quarks and atoms and all the material stuff. Our efficient cause could be natural selection, and our final cause is really survival of the fittest. And if this is the case, our 5 facets of identity we looked at before, the transcendent and the essential, go away. All we're left with is the compositional, the nature of our body, the cultural, what society says about us or what imposes on us, or the relational, the people that connect with us and tell us something about ourselves. But the problem is all of these become very fluid. So the atheist thinker that James Rachel, in 1990, Oxford Press published this. Says Darwinism undermines both the idea that man is made in the image of God and the idea that man is uniquely rational being. And he believes this is a good thing to understand that those things have gone away. Says furthermore, if Darwin is correct, it is unlikely that any other support for the idea of human dignity will be found. The idea of human dignity turns out therefore to be the moral effluvium of a discredited metaphysics. And by discredited means Christianity, and fluvium is like the froth you get on your beer or in your foam on the ocean when the waves crash. It's that stuff that nobody really wants. It goes away as it sort of dissipates over time. And that's what he says the concept of human dignity really is. This is picked up by a guy named Yuval Harari in his 2015 book, Sapiens. He says none of these things exist outside the stories people invent to tell one another. There are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, no human rights, no laws, and no justice outside the common imagination of human beings. So when you think we're defending human rights and human dignity, he said that's just a fiction we tell each other because those things don't exist. Why? Because to be human doesn't exist. The sense of identity doesn't exist in any durable, transcendent way. It's all just a social fiction, a story. So in this sense, naturalistic identity, connected with this concept of personhood, it's a property of biological humanness that appears in various degrees. The absence of certain capacities indicates the absence of personhood. Consequently, identity fluctuates with composition, culture, and relationship. So there is no stable, enduring sense of identity as culture shifts, as relationships shift, right? So you have a parent and they die. Well, who am I if I don't have my mom in my life? Or a boyfriend or girlfriend breaks up with you. What am I to be now if I thought I was going to be married to this person? All of these things can shift over time. In contrast, we could see a Christian worldview, and if I were to come up with a phrase for that one, it would be Deus dixit ergo sum. God spoke, therefore I am. So this idea is tied to this Christian worldview, this concept of the image of God, which affirms that we are all made in God's image, and that therefore God spoke us into existence as a soulish, an ensouled body. That we have this 2 parts to our reality, the soul and the physical, that give us both intrinsic sacred worth and instrumental sacred worth. In other words, the very being of who we are is sacred, and the way we are to live and act and function in life has a sacred nature to it. So we go back to our 5 facets. So the naturalist has no God, but if we put Yahweh back there and put God at the top, from his imagination and his declaration we come into being, and we restore these 2 elements of the transcendent and the essential identity. This then leads to a far more durable definition of who we are. Because each of these elements, the transcendent, that soulish nature, the essential, the body plan that God has designed us as male and female, the compositional, the cultural, the relational. All of these things reflect something, but they're even unique within that. So the transcendent and the essential have an intrinsic value to them. So in other words, there's nothing you can do to lose that identity, no matter if you've been abused or taken advantage of or harmed by anybody else, if you change your citizenship from one country to another, the transcendent and the essential remain stable. You could be in a horribly disfiguring accident and mess up something about your body or your figure, the way you look, but still there is an enduring intrinsic identity that transcends those things. But that does not mean the Christian worldview devalues the instrumental part of our identity, the way of knowing and discovering that transcendent. The composition of our body, the culture, and the relationships that we are given in this world are designed by God to help us understand and know and discover the intrinsic nature of who He's made us and how we're to be. So, the transcendent soul combined with the essential body then tell us that regardless of the appearance of certain capacities, ethnic origins, or phenotypic diversity, we are all guaranteed personhood and a stable grounding for our identity. So just a real quick example, take this little robot here and a human person. If I have this robot that's been created, like Elon Musk invents all this stuff, and eventually if I swap out all the body parts, we'd have to ask, is this still the same robot? Well, we can make arguments and if his software has changed and how many body parts, but eventually it could be so distinct and so different, it counts as something else because it is just the sum of its parts. But the human is not the same. If I lose my arm in an accident, I don't become a different kind of person. I am the same person intrinsically and essentially who God designed, although I may live out my life in a very different way because of that change in the composition. So there's a durability to the nature of us, and this allows us to flourish. So the summary of those concepts is that if we flourish only when the instrumental aligns with the intrinsic, only when the way we use our bodies and the way we live our lives aligns with the nature in which God has designed us. To kind of throw in the identity language, that means that only when the compositional, the relational, and the cultural identities align with our transcendent and essential, then we can flourish. That's when we achieve this point. And then in relationship with others, this would be my final thought, is that we flourish when the other, the person that we look at as wholly different, distinct, for whatever reason culture tells us that somebody else doesn't count or they're less valuable. But we flourish when the other is approached as an act of worship because their transcendent and essential identity is sacred and their unique cultural, compositional, and relational identity is beautiful. And so it gives us a framework to appreciate diversity and beauty in other people because we know that there's something that unites us beyond those distinctions and differences. And that's where this concept comes from. So there's the comparison of this Christian, the 5 facets for Christian identity and the 3 that remain for the naturalistic identity. And what we need to consider is what our worldview first allows us to embrace in terms of a stable foundation. But even then as Christians, we have to still consider how a healthy way for these compositional, cultural, relational will interact with these transcendent and essential to give us a full picture of who God has made us to be and how we should live in this world. That is all.
One of the most basic things that we can say about identity is that everything is identical to itself and nothing else. Like if we're just thinking about identity as a metaphysical concept, what is identity? It's this idea that something is identical to itself and nothing else in the world. In other words, there's only one me in this universe and I am it. Nothing else is me. You're not me and the chairs in the room aren't me. There's only one me in this universe and nothing else except me is me. Right? Fair enough. But this doesn't really yet describe to me what or who I am. People assume that we can describe who or what we are using demographic information. For example, I'm a Mexican-American woman, a wife and mother of 2. I work at a university as a professor. I'm in my 40s, etc. But really this information will describe a lot of people and has described a lot of people throughout history, right? Even if you might not know another Mexican-American woman in 40s, mother of 2, as a professor, I'm sure someone somewhere has fit those demographic criteria. If I'm trying to pinpoint who or what I am as a distinct entity identical to myself and nothing else, it doesn't seem like I can rely on these alone. I need to say something more. One way we can try to determine what makes us us is by looking at what philosophers call the problem of identity over time, and actually Joe had talked about it a little bit during his presentation. It is the problem of trying to make sense of how a person or thing stays the same when it undergoes change. For example, a long time ago, I was a baby and now I'm an adult woman. I have gone through a lot of changes during that time, not just to my physical body, but also in my personality and psychological makeup. There was a lot of interests that I had as a young person, a lot of experiences that I considered important to me that in my early middle age I have probably forgotten about and that lack any importance to me at all. And the interests I do have and the things that are really important to me now, I couldn't have predicted would have been important to me as a young person. So not only did I change my body, but my entire person seems to have changed. So am I a completely different person? Am I not identical to my other self? Am I just as identical to young Linnell as my colleagues here are identical to her? Obviously that doesn't seem to be the case. So something must tie me to her together, right? Something must make both her and me a unified whole. Maybe what we should talk about are what philosophers call necessary properties. That is, in order for an object to remain itself, it must retain all of its necessary properties. There are things that really make something or someone what it is. For example, being 5'2" doesn't seem like a necessary property of me because at one point I was less than 5'2", and one day I'll again be less than 5'2". My height doesn't seem to really make me me. That seems to be able to change. But is being a human being made in the image of God a necessary property? Can that thing change and me still remain myself? Philosopher Thomas Nagel has famously asked, what is it like to be a bat? Could I have been a bat? According to some philosophers, like Aristotelian philosophers, I am essentially a member of the natural kind called human. That is, I'm an individual who shares in the natural kind called human. I share in humanity or humanness with other members of the humankind. Another way of saying this is to say that I bear the image of God, for indeed to bear God's image is what makes us human beings. But what makes me this particular human being and not some other kind of human being? E.J. Lowe argues that a substance that is the most simple and fundamental unit of existence in the universe, such as a human being, is individuated as the thing it is by the powers and capacities that it possesses. So an individual human being would possess the capacities and powers that members of the humankind possesses. Furthermore, a particular human being, like myself, possesses a unique set of particular human capacities and powers that it possesses. This seems to be what is particular about me, the fundamental aspects of who I am. So I am this particular human being with these particular capacities for rational thought, capacities for conscious experience, capacities for affections, that is emotions, empathy, and the practicing of virtues like patience, temperance, courage, and fortitude, and very importantly, capacities for relationship with God. For indeed, being made in the image of God means my essential nature is tailor-made for a relationship with God. So that's who I fundamentally am. One of the more interesting things that Aristotelian and Thomistic philosophers had said about what makes us us is that our essential nature, that is our humanity, not only determines what we are at this particular moment in time, that is my own particular stage of human development that I am right now at this particular moment, but it also determines what I have the potential to become in the future. And in fact, according to Aristotle Aquinas, it is difficult to determine what a thing is by just looking at one time slice of its lifespan. I need to evaluate the whole life of the thing in order to understand what it is. Everything has a trajectory, and we cannot understand anything as it is at this moment, but only in reference to what it has the potential to become. Otherwise, we are trying to do something like make sense of an acorn without any conception of an oak tree, or make sense of a caterpillar without any conception of a butterfly. We'd be missing something completely essential about the identity of the thing we're looking at. So as a human being, I am made in the image of God, and therefore I'm made to be in union with God. Not only in this moment as a Christian, imperfect in body and spirit and will, but part of my identity is that I am on a trajectory towards perfect unity with God. And this is really interesting because we don't not quite know what perfect unity means or entails, but we know we have been promised this in the Christian promise. So this is part of my fundamental identity. True for all human beings, but also for me in particular, my identity is found united in God, not only now imperfectly, but in the end perfectly. This has much bigger implications for how I should live than what we normally think of as identity. Our contemporary ideas about identity isn't so much informed by Aristotle Aquinas as it is informed by Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre was a 20th century philosopher who had this idea that you don't have an essential nature like Aristotle taught. A human nature as we have outlined above. Instead, you are free to determine your own nature. You are free to determine who and even what you are. If you want to be Thomas Nagel's bat, go for it. You are wildly free. It is all up to you. The implication here is you can live how you want because the trajectory of your nature, what you have the potential to become in the future, is all up to you. But if Aristotle and Aquinas are right, it isn't up to you. In fact, trying to determine what you have the potential to become can have devastating consequences. Just think, if a caterpillar decided it didn't want to become a butterfly, but instead tried to become a chicken, the caterpillar would definitely not become a chicken because it doesn't have the power to, due to its nature. But even more devastating, it might also fail to become a butterfly. Due to its efforts to become a chicken, it may decide not to exercise its capacities and powers to become a butterfly, instead exercise some capacities and powers to hang out with chickens to deliver its ends. You and I may decide we don't want the ends chosen for us by human nature and therefore exercise our capacity and powers to counter those ends, but this won't result in the promise of Sartre, that is, if Aristotle and Aquinas are right. Instead, it can only result in our own destruction. My identity isn't actualized by living counter to it, instead it is erased. I become less than what and who I really am and what I am supposed to be. So what is the relationship then between identity and integrity? It means we should live in accordance with who we truly are, human beings made in the image of God, with human capacity and powers exercising them in accordance with our nature, in our natural end of being conformed to the image of Christ, the perfect human being united with God. And actually what that entails, I don't have anything here, but hopefully it's coming through the Q&A, so that's all I have.